tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We are back. This is the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Obviously, this show has, I don't want to say devolved, because as I mentioned earlier, these are important issues, and I think if political leaders aren't taking them up, certainly we need to in the public sphere and in media, independent media, all of that. But I do want to talk about vaccine mandates and vaccine passports from a different perspective here. We touched last week on what's happening in Europe and this migration towards what a lot of people fear is becoming a surveillance state. It's not just about the segregation of society based on vaccination status, but the implications of having to show that, of having to log that. And this is a discussion that we haven't really had as a country in Canada. Privacy rights in general, I'd say, are not things that seem top of mind on the political agenda. So I want to talk about this, and there's no one better than Dr. Ann Cavoukian, who was for 3 terms the Privacy Commissioner in Ontario, and also is the Executive Director of the Global Privacy and Security by Design Center, and as her Twitter bio says, a lover of privacy and freedom, who joins me now. Ann, wonderful to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
You wrote a tremendous piece on your Substack back in October that I wanted to start off on here, because you challenged a presumption I've always had about a lot of the things that I've argued for. And I've always viewed freedom as being really that fundamental base unit that you need to live the good life, as they say in political theory. But you said that there's something more fundamental to that. You argued that privacy is needed to enjoy freedom. And I want to get to the vaccine passports and the vaccine mandates, but I first wanted to set you up to explain what you mean by that.
I've always said that privacy forms the foundation of our freedom. You cannot have free and open societies without a solid foundation of privacy, where you, the individual, get to decide what information you choose to disclose and to whom and how it's used. You have to have control over this. So that to me is what freedom is all about. So privacy and freedom go hand in hand.
We've often viewed, I think for a lot of people, the big threats against privacy as coming from corporations. Certainly in the last decade or so, big tech censorship, big tech companies like Facebook and Google amassing these huge troves of data about you. We're in a new era now, though. Vaccine passports are one of many examples where something that used to be, and in a distant era would have, or even a not so distant era, would have been your private information, your private choices, is now part of your identity in a way that you must use that to access public sphere. But it's not private corporations that are imposing that, it's government.
Oh, I think government is our greatest concern now, quite frankly, because their ability to usurp our information, to tell us what to do and expect us just to accept that, they, in my view, are seeking much greater control, and they're getting control. When you look at the COVID pandemic, they are scaring people to death. And when people live in a world of fear, then it just eradicates their lives. They go along with whatever, not because they agree with it, but because they feel they have no choice and they're scared for their lives. Governments are who we have to look after right now in terms of usurping our freedoms.
When it comes to privacy, I know the 5 words you've heard that must just make your skin crawl are, if you have nothing to hide, ... And at the same time, though, we're seeing this in the vaccine passport discussion. People who say, well, if you're fully vaccinated, what's the big deal? Why do you care so much? And I'm having trouble convincing some of those people why they should care about these measures if they're on board with the particular output. They're fully vaccinated. Why should those people still care about these incursions you're talking about?
Because it's your full life, your freedom. I mean, just because you're vaccinated, first of all, there are so many myths associated with being vaccinated and the strength of the vaccines. It is appalling. And so don't think for a minute that just because you've been vaccinated, everything is fine. Most of the people appearing in the hospitals now with COVID are fully vaccinated, fully boosted, everything. So, and that, let me go back to that line you started with. Well, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, right? Wrong. That could have been the motto of the Stasi police and the Third Reich, because it presumes that the government has a right of access to all your information, and you should open up your life to them and give them whatever they want. And that's not what freedom is about. That's not what privacy is about. It is usurping the role of individuals and personal control. Privacy is all about personal control over the use and disclosure of your personal information. That's what freedom is about. Government is totally trying to change the narrative to say that, wow, what's the problem? Why shouldn't you get the vaccine? We're telling you, you should be doing this. Well, you got nothing to hide, right? Wrong. It has nothing to do with that.
Well, this is why I've been so unsettled by people who have been, especially in the UK right now, where they've basically revoked all of their COVID restrictions, people heaping praise on these governments. And I'm unsettled by this because it reinforces that very idea that they were governments' freedoms to give and governments' freedoms to take away, which we know is not the case. And I think so many people, especially in Canada, are so beaten down by now about lockdowns and restrictions that they'll be grateful when these things are lifted, at least in some form. I mean, I had a conversation a little while ago with someone about masks on planes, and I said, it's something that I fear will be here forever. And they say, well, if that's the only restriction left, then I can live with it. So people have already accepted this idea that they have to settle for less than we're supposed to have in a free society.
But here's what we're not seeing in mainstream media. There is so much opposition to this. Over the weekend, there were protests in countries all over the world opposing vaccine mandates, passports, etc. 100,000 in Brussels. There was a huge one in London, in Dublin. Here in Toronto, on Saturday, there was huge protests and got no coverage whatsoever, and all across the country. So people are objecting to this. Many, many people. You're not hearing about it on mainstream media. That's the problem. So do not think that this is being widely accepted and it's fine and we're just going to go along with this. No, we're not. We value our freedom. We value our privacy. We're going to stand up for our personal rights. And when you're talking about vaccine mandates and passports, we're talking about the most sensitive personal information that exists, your personal health information, your medical data. This doesn't belong to anybody in the public. It belongs to you and your physician, whoever you choose to disclose it to. You shouldn't have to be expected to present a passport on this. It is absurd.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Anne, is this idea of systems that are being built by governments now that I think will outlive the pandemic. Your background, obviously, you were the creator of Privacy by Design. You know very well the idea of specifically building privacy and protection of data into systems. And it strikes me that if that's possible, then government can do the opposite, which is build into systems the premise that there is no privacy, build into systems the idea that our data do not belong to us, but belong to the government. And my fear in this has always been that the vaccine passports we have now, sure, you're vaccinated against COVID, maybe you're boosted, that's fine. But this thing could very easily be applied to flu shots. It could very easily be applied to other things. And I don't think a lot of people certainly in mainstream media, and I would say in government as well, are talking about the longer term implications of these systems that are being designed and this infrastructure that right now is being created.
No, that's right, Andrew. The potential expansion of this to other areas is dramatic and very frightening to me, because it will usurp our freedoms in multiple areas where the government has no, and let's be frank, the government being in control of our information, they have a terrible record in terms of securing any of the data, not disclosing it to third parties or unauthorized. It's appalling. The thought of it just makes me quiver. So no, the government does not have a right of greater access. And what we need to do, and our federal privacy commissioner has been trying to get the government to upgrade our privacy laws, which were introduced in the early 2000s. Have they done anything? No. This is what is appalling. To rely on the government to have to take care of our privacy and our freedom is not going to happen. We have to stand up. We have to speak out. And so many people are doing this. You're just not hearing it on mainstream media. That's what concerns me so much. I want people to know there's so much opposition to this all around the world, globally. Don't give up.
Now, when you say early 2000s, just to give a brief summary of the things that have come about since then, digital apps, smartphones, social media platforms, QR codes, all of these are kind of ubiquitous now, and you're saying are not covered by the privacy laws we had, or at least we're not informing the development of those laws.
They weren't top of mind. They weren't on our minds at all because they didn't exist back then. We desperately need to strengthen our laws. For the first time, we no longer have essential equivalence with the new law that came into effect in Europe in 2018, the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. our law is no longer sufficient. So we can no longer exchange and trade and engage in business with the EU without fear of reprisal. And they've said, you've got to upgrade your law. And, Federal Privacy Commissioner Daniel Tallien has been asking the government to do this since 2016, 2017. They've done nothing. It is appalling that we have not moved this forward as we need to.
You mentioned Europe. One thing I wanted to ask about is their move, and I don't know how much you've delved into it, but their move into this digital ID that they're trying to put forward and really make this the cornerstone of your identity across European nations. And there was a Dutch lawyer I read a column from last week that was concerned that the vaccine passport will very easily be swept up into this digital ID. And all of a sudden, we're talking about something that is connected to your banking information, your residency, your employment, your mobility. How real is something like that in a Canadian context?
I'm hoping it's not that real, simply because it takes us forever to do anything.
Yeah, bureaucracy may be the saving grace on this.
But I fear the digitization of identity, digital ID, like they're doing in Europe. Then Europe will go to great lengths to protect it with the GDPR, make sure it's not centralized. See, that's part of the key part. You don't want this data centralized. If your digital ID is centralized, then it can be accessed by multiple third parties, often unknown, unauthorized. You may not be aware of it. So you have to take enormous precautions if we go down that route of digital ID, and I don't think we're ready for that.
Let's go back to an Ontario context here. You served as the Privacy Commissioner 3 terms. I think you're still the reigning record holder for time you served in that position. Did you find that the resistance you were getting was from politicians that were fundamentally opposed to these things, or was it just from people that didn't think it was a priority or didn't think it was all that important?
It was with the government. The political parties, whenever there was a political party, it wasn't the government yet. They were all for privacy, totally for protecting our data, etc. Then when they became the government, all that changed. It shifted. They wanted to control data. They want to control over our data. And this is what concerns me enormously, is that governments have this belief that they somehow have to be in control of people's information and decide how it's going to be structured and everything. And so I am very concerned, especially with our existing governments. I truly am, that this is the direction they're going in. They feel like they've got this pass now with the vaccine mandate and passports, and they've got all this control, and people are supporting them because they're terrified. This is the fear that I have, and we have to resist this very strongly.
When you talk about a lot of these things, it's easy, or I guess would have been a year ago, to be branded as a conspiracy theorist, although I find the more of these so-called conspiracies keep coming true in the last year, the less likely people are to throw that term around. But you raised an important point there, which is that the pandemic does seem to have provided a convenient opportunity to people that were already committed to certain dimensions of pandemic policy, specifically just the government control aspect.
And I fear that will be magnified in the future. The pandemic, we're going to get over the pandemic sooner or later. They're going to find something else. That is my fear, is that they're now saying, well, Omicron's going to be around for a long time and it'll be with us, and we need to preserve these precautions. We've had the flu for years, for God's sakes. You get the flu, you get over it, or you get it treated or whatever. There are things in existence. We can't raise people's fears so that people have to live in fear all the time. That is no way to live. And I fear that governments will go that route to strengthen their control.
You mentioned earlier, Ann, that the public is very much growing in its resistance to this, and that story is not being told in the mainstream media. And I would certainly agree with that, but I also at the same time remain a bit pessimistic, because I have found there are a lot of people that will use that line we were talking about earlier of if you have nothing to hide. A lot of people that, generally speaking, have not just welcomed, but in some cases invited some of these restrictions. Do you find yourself optimistic or pessimistic generally about where society is and where the culture is on these issues?
I've always been the eternal optimist, because you have to be, otherwise life is too depressing. I'm getting very concerned, I must admit, with the direction this is taking and the growth and the ideas, well, if you got nothing to hide. I remember one of the first privacy commissioners of New Zealand, we were at a conference together, and he said, if people say that to you, tell them, don't you go to bed with your husband? Don't you have something to do? Don't you have certain things you'd like to keep private, for God's sakes? Do you have no life to yourself? There are things in every life that people choose to keep private. It's no one else's business. And when it comes to medical data, that should be right at the top. I fear we're going to have ongoing problems here, but we have to stay strong and vigilant. Please, I urge you, never give up.
Well, and just on the note of medical data, I know when the government, which basically has been fairly universal across Canada among provinces, moved towards QR codes, so you can no longer even hand over just a piece of paper. You need to have a QR code. The government would say, well, we're making sure that none of your other data will be stored on this. And I always thought that was missing the point, that the vaccination certificate is itself a piece of data. It is itself a piece of information about your medical choices. And there does seem to be something missing there, that it's not about how you implement the program as much as the existence of this program, and I would say the segregation itself.
Yeah, QR codes, please. I mean, why do you have to present a QR code? It is absurd. They are so fearful. They want to retain this data and have it linked with individuals. And when you go to places and they ask you for your QR code, they also ask you for ID, driver's license, health data, whatever, with a picture on it. So that can be linked, and the potential for tracking your whereabouts, your activities, surveillance mounts dramatically.
So where do you think, if I can try to tap into that optimism you mentioned, where do you think the biggest point is here that we can start breaking down on this? Because governments have generally been fairly unrepentant, and while there have been some slight disagreements in how provinces have handled this, Liberal, Conservative, NDP, they've all basically gone the same direction. Every province and territory has a vaccine passport. Not everyone has gone the way Quebec has yet by talking about mandating or fining, but generally speaking, we're seeing a pretty unified approach on a lot of these measures. Where do you think the best way to break that apart is?
I think slowly the lifting of vaccine passports will begin, and it will take some time. I want to be clear. I think what people have to insist upon is that their freedoms are invaluable, that health data associated with your medical conditions, with the choices you make, this should be yours to freely make and not have to display to the world what choices you've made. This is very personal information. And so when I approach people along those lines, that this is health data that should not necessarily have to be shared. If you want to do, look, I always tell people, I'm not anti-vax, I'm pro-choice. I want to preserve our choices, preserve our privacy and our freedom. When you take that route, people generally come into agreement. So that's what I'm urging people to do.
Yeah, and I would also add to that as well, when these measures are lifted, in a lot of cases, governments will conveniently say that they can lift them because they worked. And this is what we've seen at the federal level with hotel quarantine, for example. The federal government was told by its own expert panel it wasn't working, and then lifts it and says it's no longer necessary without actually dealing with the underlying issues with. And I would say that voters, citizens, have to put some pressure on governments when that happens. When they lift them, don't let them bring them back the second we get another scare of, a case count here or this variant or whatever the case may be.
I couldn't agree more, but I also want to remind everyone, you're not seeing it on mainstream media, but there's thousands and tens of thousands of people are opposing this. There are massive protests on the weekend, not just abroad in Europe, et cetera, in Canada, in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And so people are beginning to object to having to reveal their personal sensitive medical data and share it widely and just accept what the government is telling us. We have to preserve that resistance.
I think that's an incredibly important note to end on. And I have to give another plug because that piece you wrote in October is still just as relevant, if not more so today. Rise up, freedom must prevail. And I think it's been very informative, just even for me personally, and the importance to look at privacy and freedom as very interlinked. Ann Cavoukian is the executive director of the Global Privacy and Security by Design Center. Thank you so much, Ann. It's a true pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.